Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we are delighted to welcome all the way from the other side of the country, Tricia Copeland, who is a YA author, and we are delighted to have you here. I love that painting in the background, by the way, of the autumn leaves.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my friend did that for me. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Craig, for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And of course, he wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems. So how are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for joining, Tricia. We want to talk about sort of various things like, around world building, around, fantasy characters and all that stuff. But let's first talk about you as an author and what you've written and sort of like how you got to this point and why it is that we're talking to you today about these topics.
Right. So I sort of jumped in to the author community in a weird way. My first series is a fictionalized account of my experience with anorexia. I had anorexia as a young adult, and about 20 years later, looking back at my life, I thought, I should do something with this. So I wrote this huge long manuscript, not being an author or a writer or anything at all. And then my friend was an indie author, and my sister-in-law both were like, this is really good, you need to do something with it. So I went through the editing process, and that became a 4-book series of just my experience with the disease and recovery from the disease, more to show hope. And so there is, recovery beyond being in that place of that really hard place for people. And then I very quickly jumped into fantasy writing because that was my love as a reader. And I set out to write a vampire novel, and somehow it got changed. It got turned around as things do, and it became a witch series, which is the Kingdom Journal series. So that was my first YA fantasy series. And then the next one is the Realm Chronicles series, which is a crossover series that finds the same villain / antagonist plaguing the witches and the fairies throughout.
I find that fascinating. So one of the things I love about YA is it's written for young people, and the thing I think that people love about it is how it gives them a context to understanding their world and their place in the world. And it seems like an unusually natural progression to write about something like an eating disorder, which I think something ridiculous like Gen Z, 40% of Gen Z has an eating disorder these days, which is crazy. And then you're writing about something that resonates with them. They see their own issues with it. Seems like almost a natural flow to go into YA fantasy.
You're right. It's funny. I didn't ever think of it that way. I experienced anorexia as a little bit older. So I was in college, and the series was written as a college series. So it has a little bit more of an adult feel, but I think it resonates with that, 13 to 18-ish or 20-ish group, which is definitely more of a coming of age. I was probably a late bloomer in most of everything I've done. So I guess I didn't think of it as an extension, but it really makes sense because my first fantasy character is a witch vampire hybrid who's 17 years old and trying to figure out does she fit in the witch community? Does she fit in the vampire community? Where does she belong in her? And it's a contemporary world in that series. So her contemporary world of when the humans don't know about the witches and the vampires, and she's mainstreamed into human high school. I mean, try to figure that out for yourself, right?
Yeah, I love, fantasy is sort of my go-to, science fiction fantasy, and I do read a lot of YA when it crosses over those genres. And the part that always, fascinates me most is the world building, is like the ability to create these brand new worlds and bring them to life, and all the things that you have to sort of like keep track of and think about specifically, and it depends on, some books go more or less into depth of, political systems and religious beliefs and the different kinds of people. And, and one thing I always sort of notice about most fantasies is like, they're centered around like, I don't know, a continent or a landmass, but about the rest of the world? What's happening on the other side? We often don't hear about that. So, how do you approach those things, and where do you start when you're building a new world for this stuff?
Right. So I'll use my example of my Fae or Fairy series, which is the Realm Chronicle series. And in that series, I didn't expect to be writing about fairies. I'd never thought about writing about fairies. I had read nothing on fairies except for like Tinkerbell, right? I knew about Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'm not even sure I'd seen the whole play or read the play. But I saw this image of a fairy, and it was on a call for stories to submit to an anthology that was fantasy characters with mental health challenges. So that very much appealed to me, the mental health aspect. And I wrote the short story based on this fairy just because she was so enticing to me. I mean, she was hunched down in a meadow and she looked scared or anxious. And I thought, well, what does this fairy have to be anxious about? Like, what are her challenges, and can she do anything about the challenges she had? So I created this fantasy Princess Titania, who has anxiety issues because her 4 brothers were killed in a battle, and now she has to be queen, or she's being groomed to be queen. But she has these panic attacks, anxiety problems. Like, can she really lead? And then there's another attack by these same beings that killed her brothers, and she really doubts that she can really help in any way, but then kind of finds her inner strength, and that's her first real test. And then her father says, "Oh, you're ready. I give you the crown." And now she's 14, and she's the first female monarch in her realm. And so all these things I just snowballed for me from just asking questions like, okay, well, what mental health challenge is she going to have? Why is she scared? Why is she anxious? Where does she live? What is she trying to protect? What is important to her? And just with answering each question for me came, another question once I get that answered. And I created this world. It kind of happenstance. I wrote the short story, and it was a complete short story, and the anthology went nowhere. I never heard back from them. It didn't get off the ground. But then I had this short story about these fairies, and they had wings, and they weren't bothered by iron like most fairies are. And I found out all the rules after the fact, and then I was like, well, I did it. So, it's kind of fun to like write your own, I guess, take on different fantasy characters too. And I was a little bit scared in the beginning if somebody would say, no, that's not right, you didn't do it the right way. But nobody has said that, thankfully. And that's good about the fantasy genre. And then I think I mentioned the Witches series. The Witches, it was a trinity of witches, and they were breaking this curse that Sonia, who is the villain, had this huge vampire witch spirit imbued army, and they needed somebody to help the witches fight this battle. And I thought, who's going to help fight the battle? The fairies would help the witches. So that's how it became this crossover series, and the short story that was Titania's story of being crowned queen became like a 5-book Realm Chronicle series. But then I thought, well, okay, if the fairies are coming to help the witches, but I've already created this idyllic world where there's not technology, or like how do you get the fairies to the real world to help the witches? And it was funny because somebody picked up like the last book of my series, so the world had already been built by that point, and said, oh, I'll show you the map. Oh, she just used like our Earth map and wrote, kind of copied over the fairies' countries, right? But the person didn't get it. But anyway, so in order to have the fairies be able to come into the human realm, their world is tucked under our bedrock. So if you think about, the firmament or ground we live on, if you create a fairy ring that's magical and the fairies can open and close, then their world mirrors our world underneath it. So the same landforms are in their world, but they don't have very medieval kind of epic fantasy feel to their world. But they don't have technology, they don't have computers, they can see us, they can hear us, they can watch us through these fairy rings, and all their water and their light comes from the fairy rings. So it's very important that they have control over those. but they're separate and they live their separate lives. But then, they break the rules every once in a while and come help the humans.
I like that. It seems like a really good way to sort of piece things together, is that asking the questions, especially the early questions that you were talking about, were all about motivations. And good fiction comes from characters having believable motivations.
Right. And I kind of set it up so that my witches and my vampires were kind of created by this creator element, all-powerful creator element, and then the fairies were too. So the fairies were put here to protect, or put in Middle Earth, which is my fairy realm, to protect the humans from the evil spirits that live in Lower Earth, or hell, basically. So they're kind of a barrier to the human world from hell, or from the evil spirits that reside there. And they very much take that seriously. And so if there are evil spirits coming into their realm, they try to fight them off before they can get to the humans, basically.
Yeah, and I think, it sounds kind of like you worked backwards from the story and the characters, and then filled in the world around them to what would work. I wonder if that's how most people do it, or if they create a world first and then figure out the story that will work within that world. Yeah, I guess.
Right. I think, I talked to a lot of authors on my podcast too, and it seems like pretty evenly split. Like somebody has an idea for this world, and then they build the characters and the laws around, if there's magic or whatever, technology systems or whatever, societal systems, or however, the people are organized within those systems. And then maybe they create the characters that are going to be the good versus the bad, or whatever is going on in that world. But then my books really do seem to come from ideas from characters first. So I'm looking at the personal challenges for that character, and then how do you build a world that would highlight or show those personal challenges, and where they're set, and the themes that you want to explore with those characters.
Right. And I think that's, to me, that might be a better way to do it anyway, since stories should be character driven. That way you have a very strong, character story, and the world around it just fits in. Whereas the other way, it can work too, but you build a world and now you're kind of shoehorning, your character arcs into it a little bit. So I wonder, I think the way you're doing it probably leads to a stronger character driven story, but who knows?
Maybe so.
And I think it was really smart, like blending the two series together is, from a business perspective, from a fan base building perspective, that's a really good strategy, because now you have the readers of one and the readers of the other, and there's motivation for them to beyond I love this author and I want to read more of their books. It's a crossover, so they almost feel like it's part of that same series and world and whatever, so they want to read the rest of them. I like that idea. Sort of like how Brandon Sanderson does with his Mistborn series, where it's a whole bunch of different series, but all within sort of that same kind of realm or whatever. Very, very smart business wise.
Yeah, when you love characters, I get into series that way too. I love YA fantasy genre to read as well. And when you get into characters and invested in characters, and even as an author, I didn't want to give up my characters either. So for me and for the reader, it's a way to keep those characters and see what's going on past the first series. And so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Okay. So take us through sort of the process that you use to create, the fantasy characters or the fantasy world. Like what's the technical process even? How are you keeping track of things? Do you map it all out? Do you plan it all, or are you sort of like going as under the seat of your pants?
Yeah, I have my little Bible, which is basically a notebook, like a kid's notebook that I wrote on, and started initially with the witches and how they were created, and the vampires and how they were created, and why the witches had different powers. And then when the fairies came along, kind of how they were created and how they got to be living in Middle Earth. And so I have one notebook that I have hidden in the bottom of my dresser, and that nothing can ever happen to it. But then later it's been transformed into like Microsoft Word documents so that I can share it with people, like my editor, who finally got me to do outlines. Like, so I wrote the first series not doing outlines, but just with this notebook, keep in like a Word document of my characters. And then by the second series, she said, okay, I know you don't want to outline before you write the book or before you write the chapter, but at least outline after, so that we'll have like a shorter document that we could like keyword search or see what happened in each chapter and then go back to it. So we don't have to read the whole chapter to remember what happened. And so she finally got me to doing that. I've talked to authors who have elaborate spreadsheets of like every plot point, every scenario, every scene is in their spreadsheets, and you know what character was in the scenes. And I don't get that detailed, but at least now the outlines help me go and not lose something. But you know, one thing that happened in my last book, I changed the name of a character. And like it was almost like we were like a week away from hitting publish, and I was like, oh no, this character name changed between the third book and the fifth book. So we had to go back and decide, okay, do we keep the new name or do we keep the old name? And yeah, so
what did you do in the end?
We kept the old, but even though there were more occurrences in the new name, because the character kind of was featured more in the finale, the last book, we went back to the old name because we couldn't, there was already an audiobook produced, and we couldn't, I mean, that would be harder to change the audiobook and all of those things. So we went back to the old name, but it was a little bit of a fix, but at least I caught it before it went out.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could always shoehorn in, a reason for it. You know, oh, that was the name I used to go by, and everybody calls me. Yeah, I'd always say, you know, I know it's funny, like how some authors are more old school with written, physically written stuff, and to me, it's always surprising that people are still doing that, because it's like the digital age has allowed us to have so much, you know, like your editor said, like searchability and the ability to save these things in multiple places and not have to worry about losing them. And, you know, like having to go through a notebook to find the one thing you want would be so time consuming versus, you know, just putting in a keyword and finding it instantly. And then tools, you know, depending on how an author feels about AI, Notebook LM, you know, which is Google's sort of thing, where it allows you to pull in all sorts of information, and then that becomes almost like your story Bible. You can ask it questions. It's not using anything else from the internet. It's just using the information you provided with AI. You know, to me, if I was running a series, I would be putting everything I know about that series into that, so that I can just, you know, query it and say, hey, you know, what was this and what was that, and I could even put my book in and say, does this fit within my series? Did I screw anything up? You know, did I break any rules? But like, aside from whether, you know, a person wants to use that, just being able to have it digital to me is like so key. But it's always interesting to hear some authors that still want to use sort of more physical written media.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, and it's funny because I say I'm such a visual person, because even when I'm writing, sometimes I'll go into Canva and, you know, make little graphics of my characters or of the world or something they're experiencing. But how I start out with like plotting out a book is I just get a big poster board and lay out the 3 acts and say, okay, these are my plot points on little sticky notes. And then I can add or subtract or move around if I have ideas. Usually have like a couple ideas for major plot points, and then I can move them around and make more scenes. And it's funny because looking at a screen, a digital screen, is visual too, but for some reason having the tactile. And when I first started, I would print out my character sheets and put them around my computer so I could remember like what this character kind of looked like and visualize them, and made sure I was staying true to their different personality traits. So I think it is whether you're just how you think, right? Some people are more tactile, some people are more visual, some people, they're different learners, and I think just different things help people.
I can actually see the value in that specifically, you know, being able to I think it's almost faster to have that and then just be putting things around rather than dragging them around. Plus your screen real estate is going to be, limiting. The font's going to get smaller and smaller as more things you have, whereas you can have a huge wall and be putting things all around. But then at the end, I'd still want to transpose it digitally. But I can totally see sort of the value in that side of it for sure during the planning stage. Yeah, I think a lot of authors still do that part of it. At least I have heard from a number of authors that sort of do that sort of sticky note planning.
Yeah, it really helps. I mean, you don't want to miss any of those things, especially early on. And then, this happened to me. So in the 4th book of my Realm Chronicles series, I sent it away, and my editor came back, like, you're supposed to get the whole thing back to me in 2 weeks. And then at week 1, she came back, she said, there's a big problem here. Like, the first 10 chapters are boring. And in YA fantasy, if it's boring, like, you can't have that, right? Like, if your reader is like, I don't care about this anymore, this is boring, they're gonna stop reading. And I thought, oh my gosh, 10, because the book was only 20 chapters long, so this is like half the book. And I was like, okay, I really missed it here. So, but at least, at those early stages with the first round of edits, I can go back and say, oh, instead of having so much storytelling or the personal interactions leading the plot, we need some like hyped up action things leading the plot too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's we always talk about how hard it is to capture the attention of readers. And I think YA readers, especially, I mean, there are lots of adults that read YA, but if you're truly targeting young adults, their attention span is very short. So yeah, you want to capture them from sort of the get-go.
So where do you come up with your characters? Because one of the things I think that works really well with character-driven fiction is obviously having good characters. I know when I write, I tend to literally just pick people from my real life, and it's almost like I dress them up, and they're like, okay, you're going to play this character, because that way you're familiar with how they might react to things. And I was just interested to know where you came up with your characters.
It's funny, people ask me that. No one of my characters is any like one person that I know. Like this Queen Titania, she is probably the anti-me. When I think about she has some anxiety issues definitely in the beginning and kind of learns how to overcome those, but she's also courageous and at age 15, a little hot-headed and feisty and off the cuff, and reacts. And as she matures, you see her kind of decide to say, okay, step back. What do I really need to think about here before I talk, and things like that. But so yeah, I guess I just kind of adapt a character to having some traits that are going to benefit them in their world and their roles, but then having some real life weaknesses, right, that are also going to be challenges for them whatever role they're in. So that's just a mishmash, I feel like, of my hybrid witch vampire character. Part of somebody who's part vampire is going to have a little bit more adrenaline in them, so they're going to be a little more feisty too, right? Whereas my witch characters tend to be a little more subdued and not quite as energetic. So I think about the physical affecting their personality characteristics too.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, what sort of differentiates, what do you have to think about differently between, writing a character for a non-fantasy versus fantasy? And I guess part of that is how maybe their powers affect their personality. That example of that being energetic, maybe in the Fae world, especially that they often have people the men are super aggro and aggressive, and so that maybe affects their personality and influences their personality. But what other sort of things around fantasy affects how you build your characters?
Right. So it was interesting, the hybrid witch vampire character that I wrote it in a first person. So that always also shapes, it's how the person is seeing themselves, right? If they're writing their own story, how they viewed themselves. So a lot of the readers, so each person or each book is written through the voice of a different witch. That's why it's called the Kingdom Journals. So it tells the overall arc of the story, but through a voice of a different witch in each book. So by the time we get to the fourth book, it's a fourth witch telling the story. And a lot of the readers did come back and say, I'm experiencing, the first character in a completely different way. And I thought, well, yes, because you're experiencing the character from somebody else's viewpoint, whereas your first experience, it was their own viewpoint, right? Like they may not see themselves as flighty or reactive. It's their normal, but somebody else looking at them is like, this person is crazy, or this vampire, I guess, person is crazy. So you have to think about all those things too, and how readers are going to be reacting to that, just which I didn't even think about. I mean, it made sense to me to write them that way, but they didn't see themselves that way when they're writing about themselves. So that was an interesting kind of duology there almost.
I mean, that's one of the things, isn't it? People look at us and have a completely different idea of who we are than we actually see ourselves as.
Right. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did. No.
Well, yes, I mean, to an extent. I was just looking for sort of other examples of how, when you're building characters in a fantasy world, just the different things that go into how you're building them that would be different than if you were in a non-fantasy book. And so, well,
yeah, so I guess you would have to look at, their environment, their world, how they grew up, what their history is, if they have any powers, or if they are like the fairies in my book, they were created, quote unquote, to protect the humans. So they have this overarching idea or belief system that's one of their goals or main goals in life. So that kind of shapes who they are and what they do. And definitely this medieval type pastoral feel that you have in this world. They are very tied to the land too, is one element that I used. They don't usually leave. They're mostly farmers, or they don't usually leave the farms. Like the kids would take over the farms for their parents, and then some of the Fae do decide to be in the army, but not very many of them. And so it was fun to build that, how would they think differently because they were given this mandate by the creator, and because they have this, over this belief system that has been handed down to them.
Right. And I mean, so in a lot of ways, it's really very, very similar when you're building characters. It's just what influences them is the same. Like, they might have that, they were given the power by the creator, but then in our world, you have religious people that believe that they're, that they were given a purpose by God or whatever. People are in our world influenced by their environment. In a fantasy world, they are too, but their environment maybe is different. The power they have, everyone has different sort of characteristics or traits. They might be physically big in our world, so that maybe affects them. And there they might have a magical power that makes them powerful, and that affects them. So it is very similar. I think it's just how those things affect the person's, the details of it are a little bit different.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just using a different creativity type, right? Because even in the human realm, there could be, a 15-year-old girl whose siblings were killed in a fire or a car crash, rather than by an invading army.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So you would have similarities to those two characters, but also maybe some differences. The high school girl in the United States may not, or in the real world might not be handed a crown to rule her kingdom.
Right, but that girl might, be being groomed to take over their parents' business,
right, or have expectations to go to this really important college, right, or whatever those expectations are. Yes.
Right. And I think it's important that there's those sort of those links to our world, because it allows readers to empathize and to put themselves in the place of the character, even though it's in such a foreign kind of world. And that's what makes that connection, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good way to explore themes like that. Like, it's a good way to mirror the emotions, the decisions, the values that we may have.
Which I think is very important. I think that's a lot of what drives us to write. And I guess especially with YA, you're reaching to a younger audience, people who are finding themselves, and you get to sort of put your values ahead. So in your realm of vampires and fairies and things, what are the values that sort of you write about and defend and put forward?
Right. Well, each book seems to have like a different theme. The first book in the Fae series, To Be a Fae Queen, is really about her having faith that they have goddesses who they pray to, who are their kind of faith-based people, I guess. Faith that, you know, she is where she is supposed to be, and that she will have the power or the courage she needs to do what she needs to do. There's, you know, themes about perseverance and courage and loyalty, and so each book tends to take on a different overarching theme for me, depending on the character or their major struggle in the book. And were you asking more about the character values or the themes and the?
No, I thought actually, I mean, that leads on to something else I find really interesting. It's like, I never really sit down when I'm going to write a book and say, this is going to be the theme of the book. But then afterwards you read it and you're like, oh, I see. I was going through a thing and this book ended up being about that thing. And it's kind of interesting. I think that's very strong. And I guess, yeah, those are the values, but also the characters have values. I started, my favorite books were the Saint books about Simon Templar. I don't know if anyone even remembers him. Used to be Roger Moore with the little halo. But, you know, from those books, I was like, the difference between right and wrong, and, you know, what's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And these are the things that instill your values. And I think as a YA author, that's such a powerful thing you do, is that you reach a younger audience who are trying to find themselves and understand their place in this world, and you add context to that, and also you help instill the values that they will live on with, and hopefully make the world a better place as a result of.
Right. Definitely in these worlds, they're bucking what has been, right? So the witch vampire hybrid was forbidden by both the witches and the vampires, because they would be a being that was so strong, they would be dangerous. So this person shouldn't really even exist. And now she's like, well, I'm here. What am I supposed to do about that? And she lives her life in secret. And then, you know, but challenging people to stop that thought. And the fairies have the same thing, because they were created by the creator, and the vampires were created by the evil angels, quote unquote, in my world. So the fairies did not mix. They would not even talk to the vampires, right? They wouldn't even communicate with them at all. Like, they kind of saw, they didn't openly like go after them aggressively, but they wouldn't have a meal with them, right? And so then Titania ends up pairing up with these witch vampire hybrids, and the old fairy guard are very much like, no, we can't do that, we don't do that. And she's like, why not? They're people, or they're beings too, right? Not every vampire is an evil character who's here to kill all the humans, right? So very much those themes of the new younger people bringing in their new ideas and trying to like kind of teach the older people that, or help them see people as individuals and not as, you know, what maybe they were characterized as before.
Which, to be honest, is one of those things that is a very applicable thing that we wish more people were embracing in this day and age. I mean, especially here in America, we've got a lot of stuff going on, and you're like, maybe a little bit of empathy, treating people like human beings. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good lesson to learn.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so to me. So, you know, not to put my spin on that, but yeah.
I think that fantasy is often sort of used as an allegory of, of everyday society, and a lot of it is sort of like transposable, but there is sort of that idea in fantasy, and you see this in like superhero stuff too, where you can create a character that is really overpowered in a fantasy world, that it's not as relatable, I think, in my opinion, to the real world, right? Like a person is still a person. Like, sure, a president is protected more or whatever, and maybe has more legal powers, but they're not like Superman, where they just can blow up everything and laser beam everything, and and then you end up often creating this very overpowered and usually evil person, right? And then you have to figure out how to take them down. And I think that's one of those challenges, I think, with fantasy. And it's usually the common theme is usually, everyone's against this one overpowered, person trying to rule the world. That is a little bit different. I mean, we do have people that in our world that are trying to rule the world, but they're usually not like singularly powerful. They're powerful because of their organizations. Or the governments. So when you're building your world, is that sort of the route that you go? And then if you do, like, how do you have to work backwards of like, oh, how will I beat this person if they're so overpowered?
Right. Yeah. So when I started the Kingdom Journals, it's a trinity of witches are the protagonists who have to not only find each other, but figure out how to break the curse. And the curse is on witch souls who are damned to purgatory. So all the witches that have ever lived, their souls are just stuck in purgatory unless these trinity of witches that only come around every 100 years can break. So every 100 years, 3 witches are born. If they find each other and figure out how to break the curse, then the curse would be broken. But of course, up to this point, it hasn't happened. So these 3 witches do find each other, and then they have to figure out how to break the curse. But there needed to be somebody that didn't want the curse broken. And why would they not want the curse broken? And how would they benefit from these souls being held in purgatory? And that ended up being a witch called Sonia. And she was the high priestess of the witches, very old witch, very powerful witch, but she was getting power from these dead witch souls. So it was in her interest not to have the curse broken. And of course, these young people who are like, we don't want our souls to go to purgatory forever. We think our people should be, our souls of our people should be set free. So when the fairies help the witches, and then, well, I won't tell you what happens to Sonia, but she's still there. So she decides that, wait, well, I'm going to go for the fairies now. They're going to be my targets as well, because the fairies came to help the witches. And so she becomes the major antagonist who Titania has to deal with too. And it is one person. She has her son is helping her and her grandson to a lesser degree, and she does have power from all these other witch souls. But yeah, it is a singular antagonist, and you're right, that doesn't really translate into our world as much, I think.
But when you're planning it out, you have to think about ahead of time how you're going to take them down if they have all this power.
Yeah, that came. I don't want to say how they took down because I want to ruin that.
No, just in general, like you have to plan that out.
I did plan it out, and it did come like, world building and following your own rules has downsides sometimes because you can't break the rules. Sometimes you can figure out how to skirt around the rules, but you really don't want to break them, because then, your reader is going to lose trust in you and say, well, why did you make the rule in the first place? So, at the end, I had to figure out how to bring down the bad person, and that was a little bit of a quandary. So I knew I wanted her gone, but I didn't realize until the end that I had made a rule that would prevent them from doing, XYZ. And then I was like, oh, well, I can't do XYZ. So I had to figure out how to fix that. So I guess it's just how you plan and how an author plans. Like, I knew some of the ending and where I wanted it to end for my main character, but I hadn't really planned how they would get rid of the villain, quote unquote, just that they would. And so that kind of at the end was a little bit of a challenge for me. And but so I knew that when I started the series, like how I wanted to end for the character, but then I kind of fill in the middle. So those middle pieces, and I do it on purpose because I get bored. If I know what I have to write, then I don't want to write it. And I mean, some people like really do those specific outlines. I'm writing this scene next, writing this scene next. If I tried to do that one time, I was like, I don't really want to write it. I don't find this fun. So I guess, but I think it's different for every author.
I think that's a big thing. It's like, that's one of the challenges of writing. It's like, if you're not looking forward to writing it, does that mean people wouldn't look forward to reading it?
Right. Yeah. If I'm bored, then they're going to be bored. But I think authors are just different. Yeah. Because I do know authors that write obviously great work and great books that are a lot of fun and exciting, but they have very detailed outlines before they even write it down. And maybe they had enough fun writing that outline and writing the book is fun too. I mean, their brain just works different from mine. And I know it's right or wrong. Right.
Yeah. From somebody who is a planner, to me, it's like, I don't want to paint myself into a corner. I don't want to end up in that situation where it's like, I've created this grand thing and I've written this whole thing, and then I realize at the end, like, I don't know how to get out of that. I'd rather plan it all ahead of time, and that plan changes as I go, but it's like a framework to follow. It's not super detailed, so it keeps the interest in the sense like, okay, I know in this chapter this is the main thing that's going to happen, but I still have to write the chapter. I still have to fill in all the details, and then when I do that, if I think of something better, then it sometimes causes me to go and update the plan that still hasn't been written yet, which then sometimes, depending on how big of a change I made, may require more thinking. But if I don't do that, I feel like all those little changes by the end are going to be a mess for me to clean up, and I'll be like, I don't know how to do this. So for me, it's more stress relief to plan.
Well, we are unfortunately reaching the top of the hour, so we're going to have to start wrapping things up. Before we ask you to share where everyone can find more about you, your website, your books, and things like that, I'm just going to ask Craig, do you have any final questions?
Nope. I'm happy with what we've talked about today. It's like really that kind of the world building and the character building in fantasy and how all that works together. And I think it's really useful for anybody who's writing this kind of stuff to hear about the different perspectives and different ways that other authors do it. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And so for everyone listening or watching on YouTube, where can they go and find out more about Tricia Copeland?
Right. So my website is triciacopeland.com. That's the best place to go. You can download free short stories if you sign up for my newsletter. So then you can decide if you would like to read more.
That is fantastic. Well, we will make sure to put a link to your website down in the description below. So if you've enjoyed everything that Tricia has shared with us today, make sure you scroll down there, click on that link, and go and check out her website. And on your journey down to that link, you'll probably notice the big empty comment section. So please leave Tricia a comment. Let her know how much you appreciated everything she has shared with us today. While you're there, hit that like button. There's that subscribe button, this little bell icon that gives you a notification every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, which of course there will be next week. So until then, Tricia, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Fully Booked. Cheerio.